Tēnā tātou katoa, nei rā te mihi nui kia koutou, kua tai mai I tēnei ahiahi. Kua tautoko au ngā mihi, kua mihi ai tēnei rā. Heuri tēnei I te taha o toku karaua no Pikitu Marae, te pautu ārongo te whare wairo o Raukawa, no Ngāti Huri. I te taha o toku kuia no Ngāti Ranginui, Ngāti Kahu hoki, hoki mai ki tēnei taha o te kai mai no kaipo marae, Ngāti Wehi au. Nō reira tēnei te mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody, it's nice to see you all this afternoon. I hope you've had a wonderful day on this wonderful day. Kīngitanga Day is always an exciting time for us here at the university. I wanted to talk today, well, it is about my PhD research, but it's also about, I've realised post-PhD that you actually don't stop thinking about your PhD for quite some time, actually, after you've finished. And sometimes your thinking gets wider and sometimes it gets deeper, and you realise that the work that you're doing in a PhD is rather momentary, actually. And so this is a little bit of my PhD, well, a lot of my PhD, but also some thinking about how I might develop on that and what that might look like. And so I draw on the concept of kaipo in my PhD. Kaipo, if you break it down into its parts, meaning breast, kai meaning food or to feed, and po meaning night or darkness. So a literal translation of the term is the night feeding breast. But the meaning that you get from the likes of He Pātaka kupu suggests that kaipo is much more than this. So firstly, kaipo is referred to a term for mother, acknowledging her as the person who provides the night feeding breast and thus life and sustenance to a child. But it's not only a reference to one's biological mother, and I think this is an important point. It also includes those who are involved in raising children, whether biologically related or not. The second part of kaipo is that it is a term that denotes a place or space that a person feels a lifelong physical and spiritual connection towards. As a geographer, a Māori geographer who is working in Indigenous and Māori maternities, then the concept of kaipo kind of says it all for me. It's about our maternal bodies, and it's about our maternities, not only as biological mothers, but in the wider conceptualization of the term, and it's about place, and very much connected to place as well. And so I argue that kaipo is one of many concepts, in actual fact, that serves to demonstrate the sanctity of the maternal body, the power and prestige accorded to mothers and mothering, and the empowering and collective approach to raising children within Te Ao Māori. I happen to be blessed with a whakapapa that connects me to the marae, or a marae, with the name kaipo. So my research kind of sits in a really interesting nexus that I am in the geography department. So lots of people who think of geography in its traditional kind of high school sense of the term kind of wonder how this kaupapa fits. But as I said, we're interested in place and space, and I think kaipo does that a lot. But interestingly enough, my research kind of falls in this quite diverse space around Māori maternities research, which looks at kind of a maternities body of literature, and there's a lot of really interesting feminist geographical scholarship, and I'm fortunate to have Robin Longhurst was one of my supervisors. It sits within Indigenous or wider Indigenous scholarship, so acknowledging those connections that we have to other Indigenous communities and their experiences of maternities as well. And there's some really interesting material coming out of North America particularly, but elsewhere as well. It sits within a kaupapa Māori, and I used a kaupapa Māori and mana Wahine framework, and so I'm indebted to all of the wonderful Wahine like Whaia Aroha Yates Smith, ngā mihi kia koe, e te koka, and others who have really laid some important foundations for us, or for me as a young Māori woman working in this space. But I do also have to acknowledge that in actual fact this isn't just an academic exercise, but Māori maternities has forever and is continued to be lived and practiced by whānau, hapu and iwi in their everyday realities. There is a powerful body of literature by scholars, Ani Makaere, Ngahuia Murphy, Leonie Pihama, Linda Smith, Takirirangi Smith and Aroha Yates Smith, to name just a few, that demonstrates the decolonising and transformative potential of our ancestral knowledges, specifically mātauranga mana wahine. And there are lots of other Indigenous women around the world who are actively seeking to decolonise maternities. And so, ultimately, research on Māori maternities and wider Indigenous maternities has to consider the question of how we provide a decolonised pathway, to use Leanne Simpson's words, into and through this world for our children. And it's that question that's kind of at the heart of my research. I want to acknowledge as well Dr Kristen Gable, who we did our PhDs alongside each other, and they're very intimately connected. Her thesis is titled Poipoia te tamaiti ki te u kaipo, and we've recently written a joint chapter together where we bring together our respective work. And so some of what I'm talking about here is a joint effort. It's not something that I have done on my own. But in our work, we argue that it's the stories of our atua wahine, the cosmological stories, the stories of our own whānau, hapu and iwi, that we can look to find concepts, knowledges, practices and ways of being that serve to decolonise maternities in contemporary Aotearoa. Our ancestral stories speak strongly to the positioning and sanctity of the maternal body in Māori society, and they provide a rich and I think much needed and empowering body of knowledge that can transform the ways in which the maternal body, maternal work and maternities more generally are understood presently and moving into the future. For example, if we're to look at the whakapapa of maternities from a kaupapa Māori perspective, there are multiple pūrākau that speak to the sanctity and power of the maternal body. The birth story of Papa Tuanuku from Te Kore through Te Pō and into Te Ao Marama. The pain similar to birth felt by Papa at the restlessness of her children as they lay in darkness between her and Ranginui. The creation of Hine Ahuone from the clay found at Kurawaka. The stories of Hinenui Te Pō, who nurtures those who have passed on, and the karakia used to assist Hina Te Iwa during the birth of her son, Tu Huruhuru. All of these stories hold profound knowledges, messages and practices that can inform and serve in our maternity experiences today. These narratives within our own whakapapa pertaining to maternities are replete with legacies of resilience, the capacity for resistance, the unique place of women and the tapu of women's bodies, the power of female sexuality, the complementary roles of men and women in maternities, and the central role of tamariki within our whānau and communities. Reclaiming and revisiting these narratives has incredible potential to decolonise maternities, where wahine and whānau can find powerful concepts, values and practices that can enable them to make sense of their current realities and project them into the future with confidence. As Ani Makaere points out, the logic of whakapapa tells us that in the final analysis, we are our atua and they are us. This on its own can radically transform the way in which maternities are understood and practiced by women in whānau, as well as those who are charged with the responsibility for caring for maternal bodies. It's not very easy to see. I should at this point out that I understand the problematics with the concept Māori maternities. I acknowledge, and I don't necessarily have the time here, but there is an incredible diversity and complexity embodied within those concepts. And in actual fact, many of the participants I spoke with in my research reinforce this by affirming the tribal hapu, iwi, whānau variations to various maternity and whakapapa stories. And so it's the story of our ancestress, no tainui waka, no Ngāti Kahununu hoki, Māhinaarangi, that I wanted to kind of touch on in this part of the presentation. So acknowledging the diversities, this is one of the potential trails that Māhinaarangi took, who was the mother of Raukawa, the ancestress, and this is just the Kaimai Ranges, kind of Kaimai Ranges heading west part of that trail, but she moved from Heretaunga, from her home in Ngāti Kahununu. She left there and headed over towards Rangiatia, where Tūrongo, her tāne, was setting up a home for her. She left there when she was quite heavily pregnant, and no one really knows quite how far along she was, but we know she was pretty well into it, because it was at the point when she got to the Kaimai Ranges and moving through this particular place that she felt the first onset of labour, and she gave birth to Raukawa. And again, there are different variations of this story, but it's said at Whenua Ākura at the bottom of the Kaimai Ranges. So I'm really blessed to be from this whakapapa, and that our ancestress left these legacies and these messages and these teachings and these values inscribed and embedded in our landscape. So this depicts part of the trail that she took, heading towards the banks of the Mātauranga stream. She was heavily pregnant when she set off, and somewhere at the foothills she gave birth to Raukawa. The names of a number of these places on this particular map, and this is just one segment, are significant not just to Raukawa iwi, but to Māori maternities more generally. For example, Ngāmu Wahine could be translated as the first murmurs of labour. Kaipo Marae was named as such because this is where Māhinaarangi first fed her newborn baby Raukawa. Te Poipoitanga, which many of you will probably know as Te Poi. Te Poipoitanga a Raukawa is the place where Māhinaarangi settled Raukawa using the traditional practice to poipoi, to rock or gently sway one's baby in their arms. And I'm told by our queer that this was often done in the direction of their homelands to kind of orientate them and settle them down. The word takapau is also seen in the karakia te tuku o hina te iwa, raranga taku takapau, and it's in reference to the weaving of a ceremonial whāriki or mat that was used in ceremonies of high tapu and was often used as part of the pure ceremony as well. Whenua Ākura itself is not necessarily discussed in any great detail in existing accounts that I've seen, except to say that it refers to the chiefly land, because it is where Raukawa was born. What is missing in these accounts is that kura has a dual meaning. It means treasured possession and chief, but it also means red ochre or to redden. So this connection of this to the Kurawaka, the fertile region of Papatuanuku, I think are striking. And it's my reading of this then that Whenua Ākura possesses a dual meaning which not only refers to the birth of Raukawa, a precious taonga, but also to the land that is reddened by birth. These are my readings of these terms, and I am interested in furthering this research, particularly around these iwi and hapu specific knowledges pertaining to Māhinaarangi's trail and the messages and learnings we can get about maternities from that. Interestingly enough, however, these kinds of kōrero, these words, the practices that are embedded in them are not always understood by whānau, by wahine, and particularly by those who are charged contemporarily with caring for maternal bodies and mothers and whānau. So why is it? It's difficult to go past this beast of colonialism. But colonialism has undoubtedly transformed Māori maternities. There have been and will likely continue to be attempts to fragment our whakapapa as Māori women and to distort our pūrākau. Nearly all of our cosmological accounts have been subject to colonial retellings, and those retellings marginalise the role of wahine and they distort the power and tapu of the maternal body. Further, the reconstruction of Māori maternities into what has been perceived to be an ideal European model of pregnancy, birth and mothering began at the earliest point of European contact. The state failed, and often continues to fail, to recognise existing systems of maternities already in place and working well within Māori society, and subsequently launched a comprehensive attack on Māori maternities, the effects of which are still being felt by women and their whānau today. And so it was the retelling of our stories, the marginalisation of our reo, the marginalisation of our spiritual knowledges and practices, the fragmentation of the collective, and this legislated assimilation that all kind of worked to colonise and transform the ways in which we are pregnant, the ways we become pregnant, well, not that way, but the ways in which we become pregnant, the unions that we have, our understandings of what it means to be a family, where we birth, how we birth, and then how we mother and how we parent, moving on from that. Sorry. In my research, it was increasingly obvious the ways in which colonialism is lived and living in the spaces of maternity. And so not only do women experience colonialism through institution and institutional norms, and hospitals tended to be those spaces that had the biggest impact on women's maternal bodies, but it also manifests in what Moana Jackson says are the little everyday colonisations which manifest wherever you turn. And participants spoke of this, particularly in the space of the hospital, as a look, a stare, a comment, a roll of the eyes, making them feel both invisible and hypervisible at the same time. One of the practices, or the most evidenced practice that has run the gamut of colonisation or colonialism and is now being practiced and reclaimed and reinvented by women in whānau, is the practice of returning the placenta to the earth. Kia hoki te whenua ki te whenua. The word whenua in Māori, meaning both land and placenta, it doesn't take too much to see the significance of burying the placenta at a place of significance. Historically, this was on your tribal lands, at your ancestral home, or sometimes at a boundary marker that marked the significance or the relationship between the parents or between iwi and hapu. Quite literally, this practice connects babies and their whānau to their kaipo. And this has been taken up by many families by reclaiming the practice of returning the placenta to the earth. For many whānau, however, this isn't a straightforward process, and reclaiming these kinds of practices mean that they begin to reweave new ways of initiating this practice. Whānau perform this particular tikanga in diverse and evolving ways, changing to meet the contemporary realities and needs of whānau. The where and when and how the whenua is being buried is changing. Furthermore, the use of ipu whenua is being revitalised in new and creative ways. Ipu whenua are the containers to hold the placenta before you put them back in the earth. And so you just see a couple here that participants shared through the research. As families negotiate and recreate a sense of place that may have otherwise been disconnected from their ancestral places, they are remaking and performing this tradition in diverse and evolving ways. The significance of this practice wasn't lost on Wahine and whānau I spoke to. And I love this image from one of my participants, or one of the women in the research. She gave it to me. So this is your standard new mums essentials list. So as new mothers or new parents, you get these lists given to you and you go through and tick and make sure. And they're usually for people who are going into a hospital or to a birthing centre. So it's the list of things you should pack and take. And this Wahine, I'm not sure if you can see, in the extras has explicitly written ipu whenua as an essential for her new mum essential list for taking to the hospital. And so I just thought that was a really powerful example about how significant this was for this wahine and her whānau. I was also interested to see in April the Waikato DHB providing ipu whenua making packs to new mothers, or to mothers who are, or families who are about to have babies as well. And more recently, you may have seen on the news the wahakura, and it's the research that's saying that these wahakura are reducing the number of sudden infant death in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. These are significant milestones because only a short time ago, relatively speaking, women were not allowed to take the placenta from the hospital or maternity unit. In fact, I ask you to consider whether or not your own placenta was buried or taken home, or what happened to it. My parents and my own whenua, and I would suggest for many of us, were either incinerated or dumped. The refusal to return the whenua to whānau when women moved into hospitals is perhaps one of the most visceral attacks on Māori maternities. And this continued until approximately the mid to late 1980s, and then hospital policy shifted. And now it's relatively normal, although not entirely, for this to be, the whenua to be made available. This is a powerful example, though, to show, and this is from one of the midwives I spoke to, who was training at a during a period in the 70s when it was the norm for these whenua to be incinerated or to be put in the rubbish. And she was training, and she said, I knew when I was 16 or 17, training to be a nurse, that it was wrong to put them in the munching machines. I couldn't do it. I used to hide them. I used to go to unbelievable lengths to sneak them in brown paper bags, wrap them in my coat, and then I'd find somewhere to bury it. Part of my role was to be kaitiaki over the whenua. And it's how many whenua have gone back to Papatuanuku, and it's 100%. That's what makes me proud of my mahi. And so she put herself at professional risk. She put herself in a position that meant she was at risk in a whole range of different ways, not to mention the issues around wairua for her in managing other people's whenua and having to deal with them as well. There are many other moments of resistance, some that are explicit and others more subtle. Non-participation in antenatal care and postnatal care, the unheard and unseen performances of ritual and ceremony during pregnancy, labour and birth, the naming of our children, the languages we speak to our children, the songs sung, incantations performed to babies both inside and outside of the womb. And as Kristen Gable points out in her thesis, mothering in and of itself is a political act, and it's a way to participate in the sustainability of ourselves and our communities. While the particular practice of the return of the whenua ki te whenua has seen a resurgence, I should point out that for many of the wahine and whānau I spoke to, many other tikanga and Māori ways of being pregnant and birthing babies more broadly continues to exist on the periphery with regards to dominant constructions of birth in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there exists what a Chamorro woman in Guam says a placental politics that still exists in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Decolonising maternities then means transforming the spatial politics, the placental politics, and pregnancy and parenting politics across all spaces, both physical and discursive, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think this midwife's quote kind of sums up why we need to consider the spatial politics of birth as well. I'll end then by coming back to the positive. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just the material expressions of tikanga that are important. They are important, but we must also look for and acknowledge those values that can inform and transform our maternity experiences. Reclaiming the collective approach to raising children, as affirmed in the concept of kaipo, is one such value that we can draw from to transform maternity experiences for women and whānau. Traditionally, raising a child was a robust system that ensured the well-being of both mother and child, and ultimately the wider whānau and community. This is reflected in concepts such as te pāharakeke, and in order to reclaim the full meaning of te kaipo, we must also reclaim the collectivism of Māori communities in raising children. We must decolonise Western, patriarchal and heteronormative conceptualisations of family, which serve to isolate Māori mothers from traditional networks of support. As Kim Anderson, who's a First Nations scholar, highlights, if we fail to do so, we run the risk of heaping more responsibility on already overburdened mothers. We must question the logic of asking mothers to carry the nations. We must ask ourselves, where are the men? Where are the communities? Where is the nation? And where is the state? And not to forget, where are the children? The entanglement of mana wahine to mana whānau, to mana hapu, to mana iwi opens up, I think, fertile possibilities, excuse the pun, for research that engages with hapu and iwi specificities around maternities. In her decision to travel a great distance so far into her pregnancy and therefore birth her son in the Kaimai region, Māhinaarangi demonstrated great strength, mana and foresight, securing lands for her descendants. Rereading this story from a kaupapa Māori perspective has the potential to demonstrate the way in which Māori maternal knowledges are embedded and inscribed in the physical and spiritual geographies of our country. The place names in the area she birthed her son hold important clues pertaining to the maternal knowledges and practices unique to us. Māhinaarangi is one of many ancestresses whose stories of birth have the potential to radically transform our understandings and experiences of maternities. There are many more whose stories need to be reclaimed and celebrated. But for all the words, we must act. The words and stories must turn into work, and the work must be turned into words, new stories with never-ending beginnings. Kia ora koutou.